we're now catching. I don't know if that's true. It's more than I didn't really like.
Good morning. Thank you for your patience. We'll get started here. This will be the April 27, 2023 meeting of the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. Before we get started, we'll introduce ourselves, starting to my left.
Anthea Dexter Cooper from the Office of Legislative Counsel.
Representative Mark Kigley representing the Orleans Lamoille District.
Representative Carol Odie representing the far New North End of Burlington.
Senator Dave Weeks representing Rutland County.
Ginny Lyons, Senator representing Chittenden Southeast.
Representative Trevor Squirrel representing Underhill and Jericho, and our illustrious staff.
Administrative Assistant Fryer.
Thanks. First order of business are the minutes of April 13th, 2023.
I make a motion we approve the minutes.
Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay? Okay, thank you. First order of business, Rule 22P37, Vermont Department of Liquor, Lottery Department of Liquor and Lottery, Administrative Rules Update. Chief Skylar Janest, is that correct?
That is correct, Mr. Chair. Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Proceed, please.
Outstanding. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Skylar Janest. I'm the Senior Director of Licensee Operations for the Vermont Department of Liquor and Lottery. I appreciate the opportunity this morning to represent filing 22P37 before you. The regulations this filing seeks to comprehensively update have long existed and have been updated periodically over the years. These changes often seek to reflect changes in statute and realities in our regulatory landscape, with the most recent update having occurred in late 2016. Since then, several acts, as enacted by the Vermont legislature, have amended significant portions of the relevant statutes, including the consolidation of the Departments of Liquor and Lottery and a substantial legislative update intended to modernize Title VII, which are the state's beverage alcohol laws. As such, many contradictions between statute and our body of regulations have emerged. Additionally, the impact of modern business practices in the beverage alcohol industry is ever changing. Beginning as early as 2019 and starting again after the global COVID-19 pandemic, in the early summer of 2022, the department began an extensive process to modernize and deconflict our current regulatory model. This process involved an extensive studies of the issues, including 11 hours of working group discussion and significant input from industry stakeholders during those meetings. The department then submitted the proposed rule to the Secretary of State's office on December 13th, 2022. And you will find the rule filed as 22P37 in front of you today. A public comment meeting was suggested as part of the department's public input maximization plan. 4 individuals attended that meeting, which occurred on January 20th, 2023. Written feedback was received via mail and email, and all feedback was considered, with some updates to the proposed rule reflected for your consideration. Additionally, the filing before you has one very late update, which is to reflect a flurry of late received feedback the department believes shed some additional light relative to potential economic impact of the proposed rule change, and that merited additional study. The department respectfully requests the committee to exclude that from consideration, and the updated red line and clean versions have been submitted. The department does consider the economic impact, particularly after this most recent updated filing, to be negligible if non-existent. As this is a substantial modification to the administrative rule, I will focus my brief time before you this morning explaining additions to the body of regulations. I will, however, briefly note that 12 superfluous, outdated, or unenforced provisions of the rule have been removed. Additionally, this rule was comprehensively updated to address outdated nomenclature and to reflect the change from the Liquor Control Board and Department of Liquor Control to the Board of Liquor and Lottery and the Department of Liquor and Lottery, respectively. The major additions and amendments to this filing include 10 items of obvious significance. The first is that this filing seeks to bring regulatory parity between beverage alcohol and tobacco products in nearly all areas as regulated by the department. Next, General Regulation 4 was amended to allow the ability of holders of permits to bring beverage alcohol onto already licensed premises for the purposes of sampling and promotion. General Regulation 7 was amended to include video recordings and associated video surveillance systems as business records, but then exempted them from the retention of those records from the 2-year requirement. General Regulation 13 was renumbered and amended to clarify that temporary identification documents that lack security features would not be considered a valid form of identification. General Regulation 18 was renumbered and modified to allow the ability of similarly owned establishments to transfer their inventory of regulated products between those locations. General Regulation 26 was amended to clarify that on-premise licenses, with the exception of clubs and manufacturing locations, were to have some food service available even if they did not produce that food themselves. General Regulation 29 was renumbered and removed the requirement for all staff to be able to read, write, and speak the English language. General Regulation 43 was renumbered to add the ability for on-premise licensees to infuse beverage alcohol products with coloring and flavoring in preparation for service. General Regulation 53 was added to provide regulatory protections for vulnerable nonprofits who engage in revenue generation via gaming in the form of break-open tickets, statutorily allowed on licensed premises. And lastly, the department proposed updated education regulation languages to match the practices and services currently offered by the department. Now, with that admittedly cursory overview, I am at this time prepared to answer any questions that the committee has.
Any questions? I'll make a comment here, but Tom Lawyer, who is on our agenda, had met with me, but I believe he's also been in contact with you, or has been, and you've made some changes here which addressed his issue. Am I correct in that assumption?
That is correct. I have been in contact with Mr. Lawyer over the last 48 hours. We've understood his position, and that is reflected in the most recent updated memo. We removed General Regulation 43D, I believe, which was the particular area of concern for Mr. Lawyer.
Thank you. Any more conversation?
No more conversation, Mr. Chair. I move that we approve 22P37 Department of Liquor and Lotteries administrative rules with a modification proposed by the Department of Liquor and Lottery in correspondence dated April 25th, 2023, which would remove General Regulation 47D in its entirety.
Okay. Representative Figley has a motion on the table. Senator Weeks?
Second.
Okay. Any further discussion? Okay. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Nays? Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and committee. Thank you.
Next up, we have Rule 22P42, Department of Health Radiological Health Rule. And Chris Brendan. Mr. Atwood, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. Just for the record, my name is Brendan Atwood. I am a public health policy advisor with the health department. Also here today from the department is Lydia Mann, who is able to answer any technical questions that might come up. As I'm sure the committee recalls, the department was here before Lcar 2 weeks ago to discuss the proposed radiological health rule. And just to provide a quick refresher, through Part A of this rulemaking, the department is establishing for the first time a comprehensive regulatory framework for the control of ionizing radiation that's produced by machines, mostly in the form of X-rays. So at the last Lcar meeting, the committee asked the department to work with Mr. Bidek to clarify that Section 812.3 of the rule allows for the flexibility to use alternative criteria. The department was amenable to that request so long as any other criteria that was to be used did not diminish the protections to patient health. So the department drafted an amendment that makes that flexibility explicit, and it states criteria that is more protective of patient health than the criteria identified in Section 812.3.2 may be utilized. What that means in simple terms is that a practitioner can use any criteria that they prefer, universal or otherwise, so long as it is more protective of patient health. To put that another way, the only criteria that is disallowed by this rule is that which is less protective of patient health. So I think it's helpful to refer to a letter that was provided by Dr. Matthew Deely, the chief medical physicist at the University of Vermont Medical Center, as well as his colleague, Jessica Clements, the radiation safety officer at the UVM Medical Center, both of whom are Mr. Bidek's colleagues. I think that they provide a helpful perspective in the letter that they've sent to Lcar asking the committee to vote to approve this rule. And what they say is the use of electronically produced non-radioactive sources of ionizing radiation are by and large unregulated by the federal government and until now largely unregulated in Vermont. The amendments proposed in Part A of the Radiological Health Rule are a step in the right direction to ensure the safe and efficacious use of radiation for the treatment and diagnosis of disease. The department absolutely supports and agrees with those comments. So just to summarize, and this was covered a little bit in the memo that we submitted as well, this rulemaking will unambiguously enhance the protections for Vermont workers and members of the public, as X-ray machines are largely unregulated in Vermont currently. This rulemaking has the support of all the stakeholders with whom we have worked from across multiple sectors, with the exception of Mr. Bidek. These stakeholders include the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, the Vermont Board of Medical Practice, the Vermont Department of Corrections, the Vermont Office of Professional Regulation, the Vermont Dental Board, the Vermont Radiological Technology Board, the National Life Cancer Treatment Center, Champlain Cable, Ben & Jerry's, Jason Williams, the Vice President of Government Affairs at the UVM Medical Center, Dr. Matthew Deely, the Chief Medical Physicist at the UVM Medical Center, Jessica Clements, the Radiation Safety Officer at the UVM Medical Center, Tom Kellogg, the Radiation Safety Officer at the University of Vermont, the Vermont Association of Hospitals and Health Systems, the Vermont Medical Society, and the Bi-State Primary Care Association. So, and I just want to emphasize this, that this most recent amendment allows a practitioner such as Mr. Bidek to use whatever criteria that they prefer, so long as it does not diminish the protections to patient health. So accordingly, we ask that the committee vote to approve this rule. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Any questions for Mr. Atwood? I believe, I assume Lydia Mann is here as a support person.
That's correct, Mr. Chair. Lydia is the one
Okay.
who needs to conduct these inspections and is much more well-positioned to answer any technical questions that may come up.
Any questions for either one of them? Okay. We have Daniel Bidek, who's on the agenda, would like to speak to the committee. Before you get started, Mr. Bidek, I would ask that your comments be new comments, new information, and not information you've already covered before.
So I just want to say that my name is Dan Bidek, I'm a diagnostic medical physicist, and Dr. Arthur Savard and I are the two that have proposed what we've done here. And we are the two that do the majority of the work that is pertaining to the regulations in question. The statement that Mr. Atwood read from the two physicists stopped at a convenient point for him. It continues on. And it says that we do not endorse all language or specific subsections of this proposed rule. So my objections are not to the overall thing. Dr. Savard and I are both interested in seeing that occur. We have some specific issues with a couple of the issues in 8.12, and I provided justification to the department, providing lots of references from national organizations, some of which I brought here, that endorse the method that we're using. I think it's important. I had included some of the regulations here and the different options. I think it's important to maybe look at what this says here. For 8.12.5, we had two objections. And for the lower one there, we believe that adding an or would have clarified things, made it more clear, to remove ambiguity from it. We're willing to drop that if the department really objects to that. I don't see the reason for it, but we're willing to drop that. However, we still have serious objections to 8.12.3.2, which says manufacturers' recommendations regarding exposure settings are available, those shall be followed. And the department has indicated some flexibility on that, but these regulations are replacing regs that have been on the books for decades. I think replacing from the 70s. It's likely to be there for a long time. And it clearly says that we shall have to follow the manufacturer's recommendations. So within that, it's talking about a couple of parameters. One is the KVP, and that's just a fancy name for the voltage on the X-ray tube. That voltage is what determines the energy of the X-rays used. The other one is the timer. How long is the X-ray beam on? And that kind of determines how many X-rays are used. So what it's really talking about is two simple concepts, voltage and time. That's what we're measuring. X-ray tubes, the technology, the physics behind them are the same for every manufacturer. And really the fundamentals haven't changed in decades. We can apply this to William Röntgen's apparatus. It's voltage and time determining the energy and the amount of X-rays. So that really, it makes no sense to have a manufacturer influence or change on that. What we should be looking at is the patient. What tolerance of energy X-rays should there be for the patient imaging? What is the quantity? And the manufacturer doesn't really play into that. On the second page of this, which Mr. Atwood referred to their recommendations, it's the exact same language, but adding that criteria is more protective of patient health and the criteria identified may be utilized. That's fine, but it's not our concern. We certainly understand that you can put more extensive criteria on there other than what's in the regs. For example, in the building code, if you have a insulation that's mentioned, you can put more insulation in your wall. Regulation doesn't prevent you from that. The building code, however, doesn't tell you that you should follow whatever the insulation manufacturer recommends. You could have two houses on the same street in the same climate right next to each other with completely different criteria if you did. That's silly. It makes no sense. It also doesn't make any sense to have two X-ray rooms right next to each other and one have one criteria and another have another criteria. So that is not our concern. I've put on here, included three different possibilities, which we think would improve the language in this. They address concerns that we have. Again, the concern is not that we're not allowed to apply stricter criteria. The concern is the language allows lesser criteria. If the vendor recommends something that is inappropriate, way too lax, which a vendor of not good quality might tend to do, that is allowed by these regulations. Now, the diagnostic medical physicists, Dr. Savard and I we make recommendations to the hospital and to the facilities. They may or may not go with those. Most of that I've encountered would go with what we recommend, but there have been some that I've encountered in my career that just want to know what is the minimum that I have to do. And so this allows an escape for that criteria. That's one objection we have. The other objection is it's voltage and time. We don't need to look through manufacturers' load of documentation trying to find if they've made recommendations to do it, because it really isn't applicable. We're measuring voltage and time, and that's an unnecessary time and expense. So we're advocating what these national organizations and experts have done and have documented, the way it's been done in other states, the way we've done it in this state up till now, that should be allowed and continue. Thank you for your time.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Videk?
No, but I do have a question for Brendan Atwood.
Okay.
So given the testimony that we've just heard, will this will this allow for a continuation of current practice?
Yeah, absolutely. As long as it does not diminish the protections to patient health compared to the minimum criteria that are included in this rule. And I think it's important to note that this regulation applies to a broad range of modalities and not just simply the machines that Mr. Videk works on. Some machines, such as those in dental facilities, have lower, or in this case, higher KVP allowances, which is why we use the number 7%. And so all we're trying to do with this rule is allow for reasonable flexibility that does not diminish the potential harm to patient health. And I'll just note for the record too, that the language that Mr. Videk proposes essentially leaves the discretion entirely within the hands of the practitioner. And so the notion that, somebody could use criteria that's less protective would absolutely be feasible under the language that Mr. Videk suggested. And so we think that this is a reasonable compromise. If Mr. Videk or others have concerns about the level of protection that this minimum standards establish for him, he's absolutely entitled to use his alternative criteria so long as it does not diminish protections to patient health.
Thank you.
Any members, other comments, questions? Short reply.
Yeah, so this clearly says this is requirements for general purpose radiographic equipment. So this does not apply to dental or some of the things that Mr. Hackett applied that would.
Okay, just want to make a comment. You're asking us to disapprove a rule, and there's certain criteria for us to take in terms of disapproval. And I'm not convinced that your argument is enough for us to disapprove the rule at this time. We've gotten letters, both committees of jurisdiction, supporting the rule in the sense that it meets legislative intent. I don't believe there's anything that's arbitrary here. And my opinion. Anyway, that's my position as a member of this committee. So other comments or thoughts?
I'd like to move that we approve 2242 Radiologic Health Rule with proposed modifications to sections 8.2.6.1 and 8.9.1 in Part A and section 1.3.13 in Part B, submitted by the Department of Health and correspondence dated April 7th, and with the proposed addition of section 8.12.3.2.3 submitted by the Department of Health in correspondence dated April 21st, 2023.
There's a motion on the table from Senator Lyons to approve the rule as stated. Committee members, any additional conversation, discussion? All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Motion passed. Thank you. Mr. Videk, I think that I don't want you to walk away feeling we discount your concerns, okay? We have a role as a committee, and we don't feel that your concerns cause us to disapprove the rule. Doesn't mean it's perfect and things are completely okay with it. But we do have committees of jurisdiction to deal with this. So if you have additional issues, I suggest that you have those conversations with the appropriate parties and maybe have some changes, request some changes for the future.
Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Okay, Rule 23E03, another emergency rule. Aren't we done with these yet? Public Utility Commission, PUC Emergency Rule 2.500, COVID-19 emergency procedures. For the commission, Stephanie Hoffman.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chair.
Please proceed.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, members of the committee, appreciate the opportunity to come before you today. Rule 23E03, the Public Utility Commission's Emergency Rule 2.500, is the same emergency procedures rule approved by Lcar 6 times since April of 2020. The purpose of the rule has been to amend various filing and procedural requirements and provide alternative procedures to either reduce or eliminate in-person contact between members of the public and commission staff or members of the public with other members of the public to reduce the risk of exposure to the COVID-19 virus and to also mitigate the lasting economic impacts of the virus pandemic. The changes that you see in red line to this version of the rule, this revised version, are all made to facilitate the transition from the emergency rule to permanent rules. And the changes, i.e. the repeals of the rule, all reflect the implementation of Permanent Commission Rule 2.000, which occurred last fall and became effective in January of this year. The Commission's emergency rule process after the pandemic began included a review of all of the Commission's rules and used Administrative Order 49 from the Vermont Supreme Court as a basis for establishing these emergency procedures. There are 3 contemplated permanent Commission rules that are altered by the procedural changes in Emergency Rule 2.500, and the other 2 permanent rules are deeply in the process of permanent rulemaking, and we anticipate their submission to Lcar by mid-May, so in the next few weeks. After submitting the emergency rule to SOS, Lcar, and Lcar, the Commission posted the rule to our website and also initiated a rulemaking case in our online filing system. We have not received any comments since the first version of this procedural rule was implemented. So with that general overview, I'm happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
I'll start with a question. You speak to permanent rulemaking. I'd like to know what the timeline is for that. How many rules you're contemplating, because it sounds like there may be multiple rules, and what the timeline is for that.
Yes, Mr. Chair. There are 3 rules, 3 full permanent rules that this emergency rule alters some portion of. The first one was already finalized and approved by Lcar last fall and became effective January 18th of this year. That was Rule 2.000, the Commission's Rules of Practice. The 2 other rules that have some modifications embedded in this emergency rule are Commission Rule 5.100, the regulations pertaining to construction and operation of net metering systems, and Commission Rule 5.400, requirements for petitions to construct electric and gas facilities pursuant to 30 VSA Section 248. Both of those rules in permanent form, we anticipate filing with Lcar by mid-May. And so in the next 3 weeks, essentially. Those rules are far more comprehensive and involve significantly larger issues in them than just these procedural issues that are embedded in the emergency rule. And so we have been working on those in an informal rulemaking practice since the inception of COVID, and potentially one of them even before that. So we are now at the point in the process where those rules are ready to enter formal rulemaking.
Okay. We had, I think Legislative Council had asked you to respond to concern we had about using emergency rulemaking in this situation and to justify that. I've read your document in response to that. I find your justification at best thin. Okay. But appreciate the fact that maybe some of this rulemaking is more complicated than I understand, and it takes time for that to get done. Anyway, that's my comment. Yeah.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Hoffman, can you explain who benefits from the extension of the emergency rule?
Certainly. Frankly, the remaining provisions in this rule impact developers who are proposing renewable energy projects, or for that matter, generation projects proposed by utilities in the way that they have to provide materials to members of the public and or prepare their filings in order to initiate those proceedings. And so when this emergency rule went into effect, a number of these provisions were sort of able to help facilitate that process in the COVID and now somewhat post-COVID world. A lot of these practices are utilized by those developers, and they're appreciated by those developers because they offer different opportunities than existed before the pandemic was in place. And so primarily these are beneficial to those individuals. There are also elements of these rules that benefit pro se individuals, let's say adjoining landowners to those proposed projects, who can more readily participate in the proceedings because the requirements have been, for example, relaxed to allow digital communication opportunities. So in the past, the way that the permanent rules are currently written, for example, just in one area that is impacted by this rule, you'd have to go meet with the developer, let's say at a town office or regional planning commission office, to review the full application and all of its component parts. That was how it was done before COVID. This new process allows the adjoining landowner to communicate with the developer, and if they so wish, to receive those materials in digital form, and so that they can have access at their home or in another setting where they can review them on an ongoing basis rather than in person with the developer. So that is one change that is still embedded in this emergency rule and will be part of our permanent rulemaking process. There are some others like it in terms of how the mailings can occur and how they can communicate by mail in a slightly more readily available way. And then the final provision that exists here that also benefits developers is geared toward making sure that the effects of supply chain issues in the renewable energy space provide flexibility for them to get extensions to implementing their systems and constructing them, because those supply chain impacts are still pretty broadly felt in this world, delaying some materials for over a year.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Ms. Hoffman?
You like a motion?
Okay, I was going to do that. Go ahead.
Make a motion, we approve 22 EL3, Vermont Public Utilities Commission's Rule 2.5, COVID-19 emergency procedures.
Second.
Motion on the table to approve the rule. Any additional discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed?
Okay. Okay.
Okay. It's 4-1. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a lovely day.
You too.
Okay, that's the end of our business. We meet again on 5/18. May 18th.
Yep, 3 rules, 5/18.
And we had 3 rules, and we're past the deadline for additional rules, so that'll be the agenda for the next one. Thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I apologize for being late. Sorry, I didn't realize the quorum was waiting for.
The change to quorum was last minute.
You'll just get lots and pay, that's all. The process for that.